Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with Honeybee Stamps. Today I'm going to be using a few of the newer products. I'm going to be using the Spring Bouquet die set, the Buffalo Plaid background stamp, and the Friend stamp set. I showed you the coordinating die, but I didn't end up using that. So I went ahead and die cut all of the images from the Spring Bouquet die set with Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock because I'm going to be coloring these with my Copic markers. Now I'm going to be working on a scrap piece of paper and I'm going to start off with this watering can. I am going right in with my darkest color, which is the C7. And in this particular image, there is some embossed lines. I know it's very hard to see on camera, but I'm going to start with those because this will kind of guide me as far as the rest of my shading, and that way I don't cover them up and lose them. So these embossed areas, it's kind of like stripes going across, is just going to be a little bit darker than the rest of the watering can. So once I have the shading done with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my flicking from either side of the watering can. You can see that with my darkest color, I'm not going in too far. I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on either side. I'm also going to add a little bit of shading on the inside of the handle. And then once I get to the other side, it's just going to be on the bottom portion of, oh, I don't know what you call it, the part that comes out, the watering part. And the spout part itself is just going to be a little bit darker. It's going to be pretty much the same as those little stripes. Next, I'm going to move on to the C5, and for these little stripes, these embossed areas, I'm going to extend this out a little bit further. In this particular area, I'm only going to use 3 colors so that it is significantly darker than the rest of the image. Then I can go ahead and start flicking out that C7 a little bit towards the center. Again, I'm not adding a whole lot here. I did have to refill my marker, so that was the pause there. But I'm pretty much just starting my flicks where I left off with my flicks with that darker color. And then for the handle, I'm just going to extend those areas out a little bit further. I'm not bothering to do any flicking motions with that. Now I'm using flicking motions, number one, because it makes my blending a little bit easier. And also it adds a little bit of texture. Now this would be a round object, so I'm going to keep a pretty strong center highlight for this. So I'm moving on to the C3 and I'm going to fill in the rest of those little stripes and then just extend my flicks out a little bit further. You can see that I'm leaving a majority of the image at this point white still, and that's going to be for my C1 because, like I said, I really want a strong highlight here to give the appearance that this image or this object is round. So just going to go ahead and finish up with that C1 and just get these colors to blend. Now you do want to keep in mind that the C1 is significantly lighter than the C7 and C5. So you pretty much want to only go over the area where you left off with the C3 and fill in that entire area. I did have to go over it a couple of times because I did get some streaky lines, but that's typical for any alcohol marker. But you just want to be sure not to go over those darkest areas because you'll just move that color around. So next we're going to move on to the flowers and leaves, and I'm not going to show you all of these because I kept them pretty consistent. So for this first set of leaves here, I'm going to start by coloring in the stem portion and just add a few flicks coming from the center, the bottom center of each of the individual leaves with that G29. Then I'll move on to the G46 and just extend those flicks out a little bit further. Do the same thing with the G24, and then I'll finish off with the G21. And I'm just going to start from the tip of each of the petals and just kind of fill in the remaining portion of the, not petals, leaves, just so that I don't overblend. Once you overblend, you're going to lose those flicks, and I don't want to lose those flicks, which is why I started with my darkest color. So I went ahead and colored the remaining sets of leaves with the same color combination. And then for these longer leaves, and I think these are for the tulips, I'm going to switch over to some YG 90 markers, and I'm just going to add some flick lines to the bottom and the top, and this will kind of give some shape to the leaf as well. But I'm pretty much just doing the same thing, just starting my flicks where I left off and then quickly going over it with the lightest color so that I don't move around the color too much. Next, we're going to move on to some of the flowers here. I'm going to move on to these daisies. Now, there's a lot of layers in this die set, and you can kind of mix and match them. There probably is a specific way to put these together, but honestly, it doesn't even matter. You can kind of mix and match the centers and the different layers and come up with your own type of flowers, whether you want it to be realistic or whether you want it to be kind of whimsical. So you can see that I'm just kind of picking out pieces here that layer up together. I have 2 centers and 2 layers of each of the daisies. I want these to be white, but anything white still has shadows to it. So I'm going to bring out my C3, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the base of each one of the petals. Now you're not going to see the center, so I'm not worried about coloring that in. I'm going to extend it out a little bit with the C1, and to kind of give it more of a seamless blend, being the C1 is the lightest C marker that I have, I'm just going to use my colorless blender and go from the outside of the petal into where that C1 was, just so that I have more of a seamless blend and you don't see those harsh lines where the C1 leaves off. Now for the centers of the petals, I'm using 2 different centers here. For the larger one, I'm going to use a darker color, and for the smaller one, I'll use a lighter color. I originally used the E15 for the larger one, and then once I had everything kind of colored in, I realized that that just wasn't quite dark enough. It was pretty similar to that YR24, so I ended up bringing in the E18, which is quite a bit darker, and I liked that much better. Now I'm going to use wet glue to adhere these together, but you can use a glue dot, you can use anything that you have that you prefer, and I'm just going to put a dot of glue and kind of layer these together. Now you can add some texture to these, or not texture, I guess you could say more dimension, just by kind of playing around with the leaves. Once everything is put together, you can kind of bend them or curve them however you want. Mine is a card and it's going to go in an envelope, so it's going to end up flat anyway, so I wasn't too concerned with adding too much dimension to these. So next, I'm going to move on to the tulips, and I colored these 2 different color combinations, but I'm just going to show you one. And again, these kind of layer up however you want them to layer up. There's 2 different centers that you can use, and I'm just going to randomly pick one, whatever one works for me. And again, I'm going to go in with the darkest color to add some shading to the base of each one of the petals. I am kind of referring to the one that's put together and uncolored, just to know where I need to put my shading. And then I'm going to finish off with a Y11, which is pretty bright in comparison to the other colors I used, but that's just going to kind of brighten everything up. Now for the other tulips that I didn't show you, I used a R59, R56, R83, and R81, but I colored it the exact same way, just in case you wanted to know the color combination. And again, I'm just going to add a little bit of that Tombow Mono multi glue to adhere my layers together. So once all of my coloring was done and all my little flowers were assembled, we're going to go ahead and work on the background, which I kept very, very, very simple. I am going to take a piece of gray cardstock, and this is just from my stash, so I have no idea what brand it is or what the actual name of the color is. And I'm going to smear a little bit of the Tombow Mono multi glue on the back of the panel, because this becomes repositionable once it's dry. Now I have my background stamp lined up on my MISTI, and I'm going to lay my card panel down, then close my MISTI from the opposite side. That way I know that my stamp is completely lined up. Being the stamp has lines, I want to make sure that it is lined up perfectly on my card panel. I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out with Fog Ink by Simon Says Stamp, because I kind of want a tone-on-tone look here. I did end up stamping this twice just because it is a huge, huge stamp, and I wanted to make sure that I got an even amount of pressure throughout the entire card, or card panel, I should say. So once that's done, I can go ahead and remove that, and we can move on to assembling our little bouquet of flowers. So I'm just going to line everything up here onto my card panel. No adhesive at this point. I'm just kind of playing around with the placement. A couple of different ways that you can do this. I know a lot of people use the press and seal from your kitchen. And just to make sure that once you have the placement down, you just add some press and seal and everything kind of stays in place, and then you can add your adhesive as you go. Now, I'm not going to do that in this case because there's already a lot of dimension to the flowers, so I didn't feel like that was going to be my best option. So I'm just going to kind of play around, kind of stick things where I think I'm going to want them, and then I took a picture with my phone. So that way I can have something to refer back to. I know that you can't see my phone on camera, but it is off to the side, and that way when I'm actually ready to assemble everything and make everything permanent, then I have something to refer back to. So once I was happy with that, I am going to go ahead and add adhesive to all of these. Now, some of these will have foam tape, some of them will just be glued flat down. Now for the watering can, I went ahead and added some foam tape to the back of that, but you will notice that the top portion, I left a little bit of a gap. And that's mainly because in case I want to tuck anything underneath it, I'll have room and that foam tape won't get in my way. And you'll see as I go along that the amount of foam tape or glue that I use is going to be minimal, and I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap with all of the flowers and leaves in case I do want to tuck something underneath. So starting off with these leaves that will kind of be hanging in front of the watering can, I just added a little bit of the Tombow Mono Multi Glue and adhered those flat down. Then I can kind of move around and add adhesive to all of my flowers and leaves. I started off with my flowers and the leaves will kind of be tucked underneath, and you'll see that I'm just adding a little square of foam tape in the center of each of the flowers. That way, like I said, I have that little bit of a gap where I can kind of tuck things in as I go. Some of these, like I said, are going to be popped up. Some of them are going to be glued flat. Once I get to, especially the longer leaves that are going to be tucked behind everything, I add a little bit of adhesive to the base of the leaves, tuck it under, and kind of, I have a couple of seconds to move it because I'm using wet glue. Once I'm happy with the placement, I kind of just lift it up, add another dot of glue to make that completely permanent. Now for the last set of leaves, I guess the stem of the multiple leaves, I did end up having to cut that down a little bit. I wanted this to kind of be hanging off to the right hand side, and I didn't want it to be hanging off my card, or what will eventually be my card. So I did have to trim down the stem, and nobody's ever going to notice because it is tucked behind the flowers. So some of the images, don't be afraid to trim down, especially if they're tucked behind another. Nobody's ever going to know the difference. So once I have everything assembled here, and by the way, this card panel, the gray card panel, is cut just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card so that I have a little bit of a border once I adhere this to my card base, which I adhered with the Tombow Mono Multi Glue again, because I can never line anything up right, and this gives me a couple of seconds to shift things around if I need to. Now for my sentiment, I am going to use two of the sentiments from the Friend stamp set. And originally I tried to stamp this onto some white cardstock with that same fog ink, but the fog ink was just way too light. You could barely even see it. I don't even think you can see it at all on camera. So I ended up taking another piece of the gray cardstock so that way we'll have another tone-on-tone look. And I stamped both of these sentiments with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I was going to emboss it, but I felt that the gray cardstock was just a little bit too light to white heat emboss it. I felt like it was going to probably get lost again. So I just stamped it out with black, and then I trimmed these down into skinny little sentiment strips and popped these up with some foam tape in the upper left-hand corner. There we go. Upper left-hand corner. Finished off the card with a little bit of shimmer with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer Pen to the flowers, and that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.